June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea. Air weight 30 hours. The morning sun hung low over the water, turning the ocean into a vast sheet of hammered bronze. The air smelled of salt and aviation fuel. From the flight deck of the USS Lexington, a young pilot named Lieutenant Alex Vraciu climbed into the cockpit of his F6F Hellcat. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a sound like rolling thunder. Around him, dozens of other Hellcats were doing the same, their propellers chopping the humid air into rhythmic pulses. Vraciu adjusted his goggles, checked his instruments, and waited for the signal. In his earpiece, the radio crackled with calm, measured voices. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, more than 400 Japanese aircraft were coming. The largest carrier battle in history was about to begin. The Hellcat was not a beautiful airplane. It was broad-shouldered and blunt-nosed, with a wingspan that seemed too wide and a fuselage that looked almost clumsy next to the sleek lines of the Zero. It did not inspire poetry. It did not turn heads. When Japanese intelligence officers first encountered captured examples and technical drawings in 1943, their assessments were dismissive. Mediocre, they called it. Adequate. A workmanlike machine that lacked the agility and grace of the Zero, the aircraft that had ruled the Pacific skies for 2 years. They noted its weight, its turning radius, its lack of elegance. They filed their reports with confidence. The Americans had built a heavy, unimaginative fighter. It would not change the course of the war. They were catastrophically wrong. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the F6F Hellcat had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. Its kill ratio against Japanese aircraft stood at 19-1. 19 Japanese planes shot down for every single Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat. It was a ratio unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare, a number so lopsided it seemed almost impossible. The Hellcat accounted for nearly 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air victories in the Pacific. More than 2,500 Japanese aircraft fell to its guns. The airplane the Japanese had called Mediocre became the instrument of their aerial annihilation. This is the story of how an ungainly fighter that looked like it had been designed by engineers rather than artists became the weapon that broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. It is a story about misjudgment and adaptation, about the difference between elegance and effectiveness, about how wars are won not by the most beautiful machines, but by the ones that work. It is a story about 30 American pilots who each shot down more than 15 enemy aircraft in Hellcats, about the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japan lost 3 carriers and nearly 500 aircraft in a single day, about the slow, grinding destruction of an air force that had once seemed invincible. Above all, it is a story about the fatal miscalculation that comes from confusing grace with power, from mistaking simplicity for weakness. The Japanese assessment of the Hellcat was not baseless. The Zero, officially designated the Mitsubishi A6M, was in many ways a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering. First introduced in 1940, it had dominated the early years of the Pacific War with a combination of speed, range, and maneuverability that stunned Allied pilots. It could fly farther than any carrier-based fighter in the world. It could turn tighter circles than anything the Americans or British could field. In the hands of Japan's veteran naval aviators, men who had trained for years in peacetime, who had honed their skills over China, and in the opening months of the war, the Zero was devastating. At Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots in Zeros had swept Allied aircraft from the sky with methodical efficiency. The Zero achieved its performance through radical weight reduction. Its frame was built light, its armor minimal, its fuel tanks unprotected. Japanese designers had made a calculated trade-off: maneuverability and range in exchange for durability and pilot protection. For experienced pilots who could avoid enemy fire through skill and agility, it was a reasonable bargain. For the first 2 years of the war, it seemed like genius. American pilots who encountered Zeros in combat came back shaken, if they came back at all. The Wildcat, the Navy's standard carrier fighter in 1941 and 1942, was hopelessly outmatched in a turning fight. Trying to dogfight a Zero, one American pilot said, was like trying to wrestle smoke. But by 1943, the context of the air war was changing. The veteran Japanese pilots who had made the Zero so deadly were dying. Japan's pilot training program, never robust, was beginning to crack under the pressure of sustained combat losses. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning. Captured Zeros were studied exhaustively. Tactics were developed to exploit the Zero's weaknesses, its vulnerability to high-speed dives, its poor performance at high altitudes, its tendency to catch fire when hit. More importantly, American industry was beginning to produce aircraft designed not for dueling elegance, but for overwhelming superiority across multiple dimensions of performance. The F6F Hellcat emerged from this crucible of hard-won knowledge. Designed by Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, the Hellcat was conceived with a single purpose: to kill Zeros. Every aspect of its design was informed by combat reports from the Pacific. It needed to be fast enough to catch Japanese fighters and bombers. It needed to be rugged enough to absorb punishment and bring pilots home. It needed firepower sufficient to destroy enemy aircraft quickly and decisively. It needed to be simple enough to be produced in enormous quantities and flown by pilots with relatively limited training. Maneuverability, the quality the Japanese prized above all others, was not ignored but was deliberately deprioritized in favor of other characteristics. The result was an airplane that weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, fully loaded, almost a third heavier than a Zero. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that produced 2,000 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 380 miles per hour. It could climb to 20,000 feet in 7.5 minutes. It was armed with 650 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. The cockpit was protected by armor plating. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with layers of rubber that would swell and close when punctured by bullets. The Hellcat could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero and keep flying. When Japanese analysts examined the Hellcat's specifications, they saw its weight and concluded it would be slow in a turn. They saw its rugged construction and concluded it would be sluggish. They saw its straightforward design and concluded it lacked sophistication. What they failed to understand was that the Hellcat was not designed to fight the way Zeros fought. It was designed to impose a different kind of combat entirely. American tactics in the Hellcat were built around energy fighting rather than maneuvering combat. Hellcat pilots were trained to use their superior speed and power to dictate the terms of engagement. They would approach from altitude, dive on Japanese formations with tremendous speed, fire their heavy guns in slashing attacks, then use their momentum to climb back to safety before the lighter, more agile Zeros could respond. If a Zero tried to follow a Hellcat into a high-speed dive, the Japanese aircraft's light construction would become a liability. Its controls would stiffen, its wings might buckle. If a Zero tried to outrun a Hellcat in level flight, the American aircraft's more powerful engine would gradually close the distance. The Hellcat's guns were devastating. Each 50 caliber round weighed more than an ounce and traveled at nearly 3,000 feet per second. 6 guns firing simultaneously could put 300 rounds into the air in 5 seconds. Against the Zero's unarmored frame and unprotected fuel tanks, this firepower was catastrophic. A 1-second burst from a Hellcat could tear a Zero apart. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats reported that the American aircraft seemed to explode their planes with single attacks. The long dogfights that had characterized early Pacific air combat became rare. Hellcats killed quickly or not at all. But technology alone does not explain the 19-to-1 kill ratio. The Hellcat's success was built on the intersection of 3 factors: superior machines, superior tactics, and an increasingly desperate enemy. By 1944, the quality of Japanese naval aviation was in catastrophic decline. The veteran pilots who had made Pearl Harbor possible were mostly dead. The training program that had produced them had been hollowed out by the demands of the war. New Japanese pilots were being rushed to the front with as little as 100 hours of flight time, sometimes less. They had never practiced gunnery at high speed. They had never learned advanced combat maneuvers. They had never been taught how to survive. The Americans, by contrast, were producing pilots in industrial quantities with training that had been continuously refined based on combat experience. American flight schools were graduating thousands of pilots who had logged hundreds of hours in the air before they ever saw combat. They learned to shoot on moving targets. They practiced tactical formations. They studied enemy aircraft and tactics. They flew aircraft that protected them when they made mistakes. The Hellcat was a forgiving airplane. It was stable, predictable, and could absorb punishment. For young pilots facing combat for the first time, these qualities were life-saving. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which began on that June morning in 1944, was the most spectacular demonstration of the Hellcat's dominance. The Japanese had assembled the largest carrier strike force they could muster, hoping to destroy the American invasion fleet approaching the Mariana Islands. More than 400 Japanese aircraft launched from 9 carriers in 4 massive waves. They were met by more than 450 Hellcats flying from 15 American carriers. The result was a slaughter so one-sided that American pilots later called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, the pilot who had climbed into his Hellcat that morning, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes. He returned to the Lexington with his ammunition exhausted and his aircraft undamaged. Other pilots reported similar experiences. Japanese aircraft that flew straight and level, that made no evasive maneuvers, that seemed almost unaware they were under attack until the moment they exploded. American fighter directors on ships below watched their radar screens in amazement as Japanese formations simply vanished, erased from existence by Hellcat squadrons that tore through them like chainsaws through paper. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost more than 350 aircraft. The Americans had lost 30. Of those 30 American losses, only a handful were Hellcats shot down in air combat. Most were lost to anti-aircraft fire or operational accidents. The Japanese strike had been annihilated before it could reach the American fleet. The 3 Japanese carriers hit by American dive bombers that afternoon were burning wreckage by evening. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war as perhaps the finest in the world, was effectively destroyed. It would never recover. Japanese pilots who survived the Philippine Sea and subsequent battles reported a growing sense of hopelessness when they encountered Hellcats. The aircraft they had been told was mediocre seemed impossible to defeat. It was faster when it needed to be, could absorb incredible damage, and its guns turned their aircraft into fireballs. The tactical situation was equally desperate. American formations were coordinated with a precision that Japanese forces could no longer match. American radar allowed defenders to position themselves perfectly for interception. American numbers were overwhelming. Where 1 Hellcat was shot down, 3 more appeared. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. Men who had trained to believe in the superiority of Japanese spirit and skill found themselves facing an enemy that beat them in every measurable dimension of combat. The Zero, the aircraft that had symbolized Japanese air power at its zenith, was revealed as obsolete. Newer Japanese fighters like the J-2M Raiden and the N-1KJ Shiden were better aircraft than the Zero, but they came too late and in too few numbers. Japanese industry, strangled by submarine warfare and strategic bombing, could not produce aircraft in the quantities needed. Japanese pilot training, its infrastructure devastated and its fuel supplies dwindling, could not replace losses. By 1945, the average Japanese naval pilot had less flight time than the average American pilot had accumulated just in advanced training. The Hellcat became the symbol of American industrial and tactical supremacy in the Pacific Air War. It was not the fastest American fighter. The Mustang was faster. It was not the most heavily armed. The Corsair carried more firepower. It was not the most advanced. The jets and rocket planes being developed in the war's final months represented the future. But the Hellcat was available in enormous quantities exactly when it was needed most, from mid-1943 through the end of the war. More than 12,000 were built. They equipped nearly every carrier in the Pacific Fleet. They were reliable, maintainable, and deadly. They did their job with ruthless efficiency. The irony of the Japanese assessment of the Hellcat as mediocre is that they were looking at the wrong qualities. They saw an aircraft that could not match the Zero's turn rate and concluded it was inferior. What they failed to see was that turning ability, the quality Japanese designers had optimized for, had become largely irrelevant to modern air combat. The Hellcat represented a different philosophy entirely, one that prioritized survivability, firepower, production efficiency, and tactical flexibility. It was an aircraft designed by a nation that understood war as an industrial and systemic enterprise, rather than a test of individual warrior spirit. American factory workers in Bethpage, New York, built Hellcats on assembly lines that operated 24 hours a day. Women who had never worked outside the home before the war riveted aluminum sheets and installed hydraulic systems. Engineers tested new modifications and rushed them into production. By 1945, Grumman was producing Hellcats faster than the Navy could train pilots to fly them. The same month that Japanese factories were being reduced to rubble by American bombers. The same month that Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with fuel for one-way missions. American carriers were receiving Hellcats equipped with radar, with improved engines, with refined aerodynamics. The production advantage was so overwhelming that it ceased to be military and became metaphysical, a demonstration of the difference between industrial democracies and empires built on conquest. For Japanese pilots, the symbol of their doom was not dramatic or exotic. It was a stubby, practical fighter with a bent-wing silhouette that appeared in the distance in ever-increasing numbers. Some Japanese accounts from late in the war described the psychological impact of seeing formations of dozens of Hellcats approaching. There was nowhere to run. The American fighters were too fast to escape, too numerous to fight, too well coordinated to evade. Japanese pilots began taking off knowing they would not return, not because they had chosen to die, but because survival had become statistically impossible. The 19-to-1 kill ratio was not just a number. It represented 19 young men who climbed into Zeros or other Japanese fighters, who believed they were defending their nation, who died in flames or falling through the sky. For every American pilot killed in air-to-air combat in a Hellcat. It represented the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation, the elimination of Japan's ability to defend its maritime empire, the opening of the sea lanes that allowed American forces to approach the Japanese home islands. Every Hellcat victory was another step toward Iwo toward Okinawa, toward the fires that would consume Japanese cities in 1945. By the war's end, some of the most successful American aces had flown exclusively in Hellcats. Commander David McCampbell shot down 34 Japanese aircraft in a Hellcat, becoming the Navy's top ace. Lieutenant Cecil Harris destroyed 24 enemy planes. Dozens of other pilots achieved ace status, 5 or more confirmed kills in the type. The Hellcat had carried them through the war and brought them home. Many of them would later speak about the aircraft with an affection bordering on reverence. It was not the most exciting airplane to fly, they said. It was not particularly graceful or responsive, but it was tough and it was dependable. And when you needed it to kill, it killed. The Japanese never publicly acknowledged their initial assessment of the Hellcat as mediocre. There are no surviving documents where Japanese officers admitted their error. But the evidence was written in the sky over every major Pacific battle from mid-1943 onward. It was written in the empty carrier decks, in the training schools that could no longer replace losses, in the desperate tactics of the war's final months. The mediocre American fighter had achieved what elegant Japanese engineering could not. It had survived contact with reality and emerged victorious. There is a photograph from the summer of 1945, taken on the deck of an American carrier somewhere in the Pacific. In the foreground, a Hellcat sits with its engine cowling open while mechanics work on the radial engine. The aircraft's paint is faded and chipped. Its fuselage bears the scars of combat, patches over bullet holes, replacement panels, and slightly different shades of blue. In the background, more Hellcats are visible, lined up wing to wing, ready for another mission. The photograph is unremarkable in most respects. But if you look carefully at the fuselage of the Hellcat in the foreground, you can see a row of small Japanese flags painted beneath the cockpit. 13 of them. 13 confirmed kills. 13 Japanese pilots who had encountered this particular aircraft and not survived. The airplane looks exactly like what it was. A working machine, practical and unbeautiful, scarred by use and utterly effective. This was the truth the Japanese had failed to see in their initial assessment. The Hellcat was mediocre only if you measured it by the wrong criteria. Measured by what mattered. By combat effectiveness, by survivability, by the ability to be produced in war-winning numbers, by the capacity to achieve and maintain air superiority. It was perhaps the most successful carrier fighter ever built. Its ungainly appearance concealed a brutal pragmatism. It was designed not to be admired but to win, and it won with a thoroughness that changed the course of the Pacific War. The 19-to-1 kill ratio stands as a monument to the danger of underestimating an opponent, of confusing surface impressions with underlying reality, of clinging to outdated tactical concepts in a war that had evolved beyond them. The Japanese looked at the Hellcat and saw a machine that did not match their aesthetic and tactical preferences. They saw weight where they valued lightness, simplicity where they valued refinement, blunt force where they valued elegance. They failed to see what the Hellcat actually represented, a philosophy of warfare that would prove superior to their own, not because it was more beautiful, but because it worked. August 15th, 1945. The war was over. Across the Pacific, on carriers and airfields, Hellcats sat silent. Some would be scrapped, cut apart and melted down, their metal recycled into the machinery of peace. Others would serve on for years, flying with the navies of nations rebuilding after the war. A few would be preserved in museums where visitors could walk around them and marvel at how something so ordinary-looking had been so devastatingly effective. The pilots who had flown them would go home, many of them, and live long lives. Some would occasionally gather at reunions and tell stories about missions flown decades before, about the aircraft that had carried them through the most dangerous skies on Earth and brought them home alive. The Hellcat, that supposedly mediocre fighter, had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had won.